I think the fiction of New York history and New Yorkers' self-perception is that they were the most tolerant people in the world, the cosmopolitan New Yorker, able to accept anyone who came. The reality of New York history reveals quite a bit more tension and conflict in the actual day-to-day social relations of New Yorkers.
This was never say that welcomed immigrants. If you read the history of New York, whichever group was coming at the time, everyone hated. And then the group that got here 5 minutes before them had someone to look down on, and that's always been the case.
June 2nd, 1836. There arrived at this port during the month of May 15,825 passengers. All Europe is coming across the ocean. All that part at least who cannot make a living at home. And what shall we do with them? They increase our taxes, eat our bread, and encumber our streets. And not 1 in 20 is competent to keep himself. Philip Hone.
For years, the number of immigrants coming into the city had been on the rise as the demand for workers grew. By 1840, more than 50,000 Germans had pushed in, settling in an insulated neighborhood of their own called Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany. An even greater number had emigrated from Ireland, impoverished farmers and unskilled day laborers mainly, most of whom quickly found work, taking on the worst and toughest jobs in the city, digging sewers, paving streets, building houses, or working as servants, scullery maids, and seamstresses. By 1842, nearly 100,000 Irish immigrants had flooded into New York City, fueling waves of virulent anti-Catholic bigotry and the bitter resentment of native-born workers who feared for their jobs.
It's very hard for people nowadays to realize there was a white, Christian, English-speaking immigrant group that was essentially seen as another race, so foreign that they could never be absorbed into the United States. Their arrival really in the 1840s triggers the growth of the American Party, as it's called at the time, or the Know-Nothing Party, which is essentially said we have to stop the immigration of these people to the country. They're going to destroy our identity. They can never be loyal because of their loyalty to the Catholic Church. They don't want to work, they're shiftless, they're violent. This was the perception.
One of the most interesting things about the Irish is the kind of discrimination that they faced when they came to New York. All of the cartoons of the period show them with huge brows, show them drunk all the time, show them involved in fights and brawls. The Irish were called the blacks of the 19th century. They were not considered to be white.
Ethnic conflict had already reached alarming levels on the streets of the city, when in the summer of 1845, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions in the Irish countryside sent a tidal wave of desperate people streaming towards New York. In the years to come, the influx of famine Irish immigrants would overwhelm the city's resources completely and change forever the social and political balance of the metropolis.
The Great Migration begins in 1845. Between 1845 and 1855, you have 1 million people die in Ireland in the potato famine, the great defining event of modern Irish history. 2.1 million leave. Of the 1.5 that come to the United States, 1 million come across South Street in a 10-year period. And it's an immigration very unlike the immigrations that follow. One, because it's in sailing ships. It's not in the steamships that become the regular vessel across the Atlantic in 7 days. This is a 30-day passage. Some of them were called coffin ships because there were more people dead on them than alive when they landed. And you have 1 million people, 1/8 of the Irish nation comes across South Street in a 10-year period. There's no other immigration from Europe like that in the 19th century.
Hundreds of our people, just cast on shore from the immigrant ships, parade daily the streets of New York as howling beggars. They sleep in droves in the station houses, the commissioners supplying them with bread. In the morning, they wander over the city, begging.
No city on earth had ever had to contend with such an onslaught of humanity. In 1854, An old concert hall at the foot of Manhattan, called Castle Garden, was pressed into service to handle the flood tide of impoverished newcomers. By then, there were more Irish in New York City than any other place in the world except Dublin. And still they came on, pushing the congestion in the new slums to more than 300 people per acre. 5 times the density city fathers had anticipated when laying out the street plan 50 years before.
The huge famine Irish immigration that hit in the 40s brought here a rural people who had no urban skills. Many of them had no English, and settled into pretty miserable conditions pretty fast.
As thousands of Irish immigrants pushed into the 5 Points, one of the only areas in the city where African Americans could afford to live, the two groups were thrown into increasingly bitter competition for the worst dwellings and the lowest paying jobs.
Every hour sees us elbowed out of some employment, to make room, perhaps, for some newly arrived immigrants, whose hunger and color are thought to give them title to a special favor. Frederick Douglass.
We'd like to think that segregation is a Southern phenomenon. It's not. It's a Northern phenomenon. And there are black burial grounds, and there are white burial grounds. There are black sections in churches, the nigger pews up in the top. So racism is built into the very structure and culture of the city, and it's only exacerbated by the new arrivals.
Profit-hungry New York businessmen only made matters worse, hiring Irish laborers instead of blacks because they would work for even less money, then using blacks as strikebreakers whenever the Irish threatened a walkout for better wages. By 1855, the two groups with the most in common in New York were locked in a life-and-death struggle on the lowest rung of the city's economic ladder.
Of the two groups that have come to New York, there are striking similarities between the Irish and African Americans. The Irish come from a rural culture in which they are essentially dispossessed. They're not connected to the government where they come from. There are no institutions that reflect who they are. Their culture is in two things, really. It's in their song and it's in their church. And those are the two things they take with them when they come out of this culture where they've even lost their language. They take on the language of the people who've conquered them, and they give new life to that language.
Few groups coming to New York would ever suffer the hardship and misery experienced by the famine Irish, crowded into filthy, vermin-infested housing and brutally derided by their fellow citizens. Devastating outbreaks of cholera and other diseases routinely swept through the wards they inhabited, where the death rate was often 3 times higher than the rest of the city. Infants and children die in fearful ratios, one worried observer noted. And yet, even as the concern of middle-class reformers mounted, most New Yorkers blamed the newcomers themselves for their condition.
You have no idea what an immense vat of misery and crime and filth this great city is. I realize it more and more. Think of 10,000 children growing up almost sure to be prostitutes and rogues. Charles Loring Brace.
Fearing for the future of the city, Protestant missionaries invaded the slums, hoping to assimilate the Irish before it was too late. In 1853, an Episcopal clergyman named Charles Loring Brace started the Children's Aid Society. For 17 cents a night, abandoned children could get a warm bed and bath, a hot supper of pork and beans, and, to the fury of Irish Catholic New Yorkers, Protestant religious instruction, often administered by Brace himself.
Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society. He wrote a book called The Dangerous Classes of New York, and he pointed to the condition of the children living in those cellar holes without parental supervision, so often orphans, often abandoned. He called them the dangerous classes of New York. He said, you see them now, but wait. In 20 years' time, they will have grown up and they will vote. And what will they vote themselves? And we have to respond to them.
You've got a city that is overrun with thousands of vagrant children, neighborhoods in which church life doesn't seem to really be that important. So from the perspective of people like Hone or Brace or other middle-class and upper-class reformers, I think the 1850s really seems like a crisis moment precisely because traditional sources of authority no longer seem to be able to keep the city under control.
The streets